This is the Anthrobiology Podcast, hosted by me, Gabby LaPera. Every 2 weeks, I interview a biological anthropologist about what makes us, us. Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Anthrobiology Podcast. Joining me here today, I have Dr. Trent Trombley. How are you?
Doing well. How are you?
I'm really good. You are at Augustana University?
Correct. Yes, in Sioux Falls, South Dakota.
And how are you liking South Dakota after having recently moved from California?
Yeah, being born and raised the first 30 years of my life in California and then going to the Midwest where the winters are a bit more harsh. We are in the thick of it now. We just came out of a blizzard wind chill weekend of negative 45 with wind chill. So that I've never experienced before in California. But me and my wife have really loved it here. Everyone's been super friendly. We've loved the area. We've gotten to go hiking, camping, explore some of the national parks. It's been absolutely lovely. Everyone on campus has been super welcoming. So it's been a tremendously lovely move.
That is so nice. We were chatting before. I went to Nebraska for grad school, and I actually love Nebraska, which none of my bi-coastal friends seem to understand. But I'm like, it's pretty cool.
Yeah, I think there's just such a weird sort of coastal demographic thing, and you get those comments of flyover states or things like that. But the truth is, most people have never been or spent a prolonged period of time there. They might have gone for a conference or maybe visited something or whatever, but they haven't spent a copious amount of time there, which is where you really get to know the people and the area and the food and the kind of differences that are lovely.
I will say one thing is that if you do go, I would recommend a warmer month, especially if you're not. the winters really are no joke.
Yeah, they aren't. That's true.
One of the things I loved about Nebraska were how many like tiny town festivals there are. There's Kool-Aid days because Kool-Aid was invented in Nebraska, and there's Czech Fest, and there's State Fair is incredible. And I'm sure
I had no idea.
Yeah.
We did have some of that. We moved here in the summer, and I remember shortly after moving here, it was like Chislic Festival, Cheese Curd Festival. There was all these sort of fun food festivals that cropped up all in the area and nearby towns, and I thought that was really cool.
Yeah, it's really cool. I strong recommend, but definitely summertime unless you're emotionally prepared for the cold. And I am not anymore. I live in California and I horseback ride, and when I drive, the like topology and ecology of the bay is such that if you drive like 30 minutes inland, it's a completely different temperature.
Oh, totally. Yeah.
So I will drive, and over the course of my drive, it'll go from 50 degrees to 30 degrees, and I'm wildly unprepared.
Yeah, when I was finishing up grad school, I actually lived in Merced, so quite a ways away from the Bay Area on campus, but I would commute in towards the last portion of finishing my dissertation. And it was wild to see some of the microclimate changes going from close-ish to the base of Yosemite, the valley, to the Bay. You would get a tremendous transition in that climate. And, it really is, it speaks to the microclimate of California quite a bit.
So, but for someone who thinks 30 degrees Fahrenheit is cold, I think negative 45 is pretty much, I've been ruled right out there.
Yeah, I understand that.
Okay, so I am very excited to have you on. We're going to talk about teeth today, and you're not the first tooth person I have talked to.
No.
But I'm excited to talk to you because we're going to talk about like macroscopic tooth analysis, which is something that I don't think we've really done a deep dive on yet on the show. And it's really cool because teeth you don't have to use lasers and microscopes and stuff to look at them. You can just use your eyes, and you can learn a lot of things about people. You can also use lasers and microscopes and learn a lot of things too.
Yeah.
But they're really cool. And teeth are especially neat because they preserve super well. So you find them in a ton of archaeological context. I feel like I'm taking away your thunder, actually. Can I ask you, why would one want to study teeth in an archaeological context?
Yeah, so I'll be fully transparent. I did not want to study teeth going into it. I came out of my undergraduate studies wanting to be as far away from teeth as possible. And what happened was there was an opportunity to work with this particular assemblage. It was a skeletal assemblage, a cemetery assemblage that had been excavated in the mid-2000s in rural Italy, about 70 or so kilometers southeast of Rome. And most of it had dated to the medieval period. And I had some mentors and colleagues at the time who were analyzing the various portions of the skeletons for questions about growth and development. And one of the opportunities that came up, which I was super fortunate to be a part of, was to go with them to Rome to work on these skeletons, but under the stipulation that I would be looking at the teeth. And I definitely didn't have the interest, I suppose, at the time. I had not really done super well on the tooth portion of my osteology class. I mean, I did okay, but it was not something I was super interested in. But we were going to try to look at it from a growth and development perspective. And so we were actually going to look at linear enamel hypoplasia, these horizontal bands that can form in the enamel that can correspond with aspects of non-specific stress. And sure enough, we were trying to actually implement a microscopic approach to those teeth. And so what I was commissioned to do there was really to take as many molds as possible of the teeth in the field, come back to the US, make replicas, and then experiment with some of the different microscopes that we had on campus at UC Berkeley. And as part of that collection, I started to just collect the sort of standard dental inventory data. What teeth are there for this individual? Are there any cavities? If so, where are they? What about gum disease? The kind of standard, I would say, traditional bioarchaeological approach to teeth from a macroscopic perspective. And while we were hitting a bit of a wall with the linear enamel hypoplasia, just by virtue of which microscopes we had in our lab, and we were trying to weigh, is it worth it to try to get a whole new one? How do we collaborate across campus or something like that? I just started to analyze the macroscopic data that I had, and things started to get pretty interesting. And so that's really my route into it was very circuitous, and it was not intentional. But I've learned to love teeth, and I really appreciate people who do dental anthropology and do any sort of analysis on teeth, like you said, because they just preserve so well, and they're so dense with information. They're so dense, and so they can really be a font of knowledge and information for us.
What kinds of information can you get from teeth?
Yeah, so you can get all sorts of stuff. One of the biggest things you can get, again, from our perspective, is growth and development. Teeth are pretty tightly genetically controlled in terms of their formation and eruption. There's a bit of variability, but generally speaking, they tend to correspond with particular hallmarks of growth and development. This makes sense from an evolutionary perspective. We want to be able to wean off of things like breast milk pretty quickly at some point and transition to harder foodstuffs. Teeth are going to be pretty important for that. But we can also get aspects of maybe what people ate, not just from the macroscopic analysis, say the cavities or things like that, but what's embedded in the tartar or plaque buildup. We oftentimes call it calculus. It sounds like the math discipline, but in our case, we're referring to the fossilized plaque that can trap microscopic remains of plant remains or other materials as well as DNA sequencing of that calculus, which is becoming more and more used in our field today, which is really interesting. You can also trap the chemical within the chemical matrix of teeth. We would get information from stable isotope analysis. So we can look at maybe the percentage of carbon or nitrogen and other isotopes that can yield information on what this person ate as well. And then we can compare across different teeth or between the teeth and different bones to see how diet maybe changed even over someone's lifetime or their life course, which is super fascinating.
Yeah, so one of the really cool things about teeth is, like you said, there's like a very rigid developmental schedule for them. So like you can see how someone's diet changed, like from them being a very, very small baby kid, well, ish, because you also lose your baby teeth, but you can see how things change over time up until a certain point when teeth stop. And then you can start looking at the calculus. Side note, if you have children and they don't like brushing their teeth, you can show them pictures of dental calculus on archaeological specimens. There are some truly gnarly.
Oh yeah, I'm happy to forward an image to anyone who wants one. Absolutely.
Yeah, every once in a while you get into an old collection and you're like, oh no.
Yeah, there's one individual I've looked at in particular where I thought there's not even a scoring number for this. The whole point was like the old Brothwell system from I think the 80s, like a 0, 1, 2, 3. And I was like, this is a 5. This extends like millimeters and millimeters in a certain direction that I've never seen before. So it's tremendous variability there as well.
Yeah. Also, okay, so my mom called me the other day and she said that she heard somewhere, and I have yet to see her produce the study that says this, that apparently 8% of people who work from home never brush their teeth. Like the only thing that was making them brush their teeth was social pressure.
Interesting. I would like to see that. So I'd be curious. I suppose it could be possible.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know if it's true, but like, just, I don't know. Do you?
The idea being I will brush my teeth if I have to go out of my house and face other people where I might otherwise be stigmatized for bad breath or something like that.
I think there's that. I mean, I want to see this study because like I also have questions about how many people are working from home that also have like mental challenges that
Sure.
might make it harder for you to brush your teeth. I have been
Sure.
depressed. I understand that.
Sure.
But 8% still seems like a wild number.
Yeah, yeah. I'd be curious. If you find the study, send it to me. I'd be curious to see.
Do you hear that,
That'd be
Mom?
interesting.
I need you to send me this study. I've asked you twice. Um, uh, question 2. This is like also just about your daily life. When you go to the dentist, do you annoy them with your teeth facts?
I tend to nerd out pretty hard with them. And now I will say this, my orthodontist way back in the day when I was getting ready to get my wisdom teeth out, we chatted for a long time, way longer than probably his appointment slot was for about the sort of things that I had seen through my field work. And that was a lot of fun. So much so that I got to chat with him and other dentists and write a little column for their dentist newsletter article series about what we can learn from archaeological teeth, which was really fun. And then my actual dentist growing up was lived 2 doors down from us. He was our neighbor, and I was best friends with his kids. And so I've known him over the course of my life. And as I got more and more into anthropology, more and more into dental anthropology, I would chat with him more and more about this, which was super fun. And we would start to nerd out about what we can learn from teeth archaeologically. I would chat with the dental hygienist. I bet at some point they were like, okay, dude, we get it. You've seen a lot of like archaeological teeth. We treat like living people's teeth. And I give them all the credit in the world to doing that. I don't have to worry about inflicting the same level of discomfort or pain, let's say, to the maxillary, structure when I'm looking at an archaeological specimen, but or individual. But yeah,
Totally, totally. Okay, sorry. I'm gonna bring us back
of course.
to our topic, which is teeth. Teeth in late medieval remains in a specific study population. So what we're gonna talk about today are 2 papers that you wrote that did like a macroscopic analysis of the of Villamagna.
Villamagna, yeah.
Villamagna. That's so funny because
The G is kind of silent.
in my
Yeah.
head it was Via Magna,
Yeah.
which is the opposite.
What I've heard it different. And you'll see it spelled differently too. Sometimes it'll be bifurcated into 2 words. It'll be villa and then or via and then magna separate. Sometimes it'll be more conjoined. I think it changes the conjoining, if I remember correctly, throughout the medieval period, depending on if it's under Roman, when during the Roman period versus the early medieval, central medieval, later medieval. It sort of changes politically throughout those phases. And so the name sort of changes as well. Follow that.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So we're going to talk about Villa Magna. And I'm super excited about this. Let's talk a little bit about the macroscopic analysis. And I think the place that I want to start is we're going to kind of ease our way into this with
Sure.
activity induced dental modifications.
Yeah.
So for listeners, this should be like a fairly familiar concept to you. Like we've talked a lot about on the show about how physical activity can modify bones. Physical activity can also modify teeth.
Yeah, precisely. So again, one of the interesting things about teeth is that the enamel portion of teeth, the harder white exterior substance, is almost entirely mineralized, right? It's around 98% or so mineral, and then the rest is water and some other sort of soluble ground substance and things like that. And so, for the most part, there's just sort of mineral rocks. Mouth rocks is kind of the joke we have among friends. And as a result, anything that happens to enamel tends to be pretty permanent. It tends to be an indelible marker of something that happened in the past because it's not able to remodel and repair itself the same way that something like dentin or bone can. Bone being 1/3 organic can really repair itself much better and more actively. When you break a bone, you can repair that bone through forming a callus, and different bone cells are going to go in and repair that. Not so really with enamel. Now, as a sort of sidebar, there's some really fascinating experimental research going on right now on trying to figure out how to get enamel cells to kind of regrow, to trick them into regrowing themselves. From last I saw, there was a study in Japan, I think about a year ago. I'd have to do some follow up to see. I don't want to, say that what the results are, but I remember seeing that pop up in a couple of circles. So that's been kind of interesting from a public health perspective on in dentistry.
That'd be super cool.
Yeah, it's like sci-fi stuff. I think it's so fascinating. But what that means is that behaviors can then affect things like teeth, especially enamel, and leave permanent markers. And so activity-induced dental modifications are really fascinating when we start to see how certain behaviors can leave those particular markers within teeth. One of the ones that I tend to go to quite a bit, and you see this a lot of the literature, is things like sewing or any sort of fiber processing. And when you think about it, the mouth is a pretty effective, what we call third hand. That is, we oftentimes use our mouth, sometimes unintentionally, subconsciously, to open things, right? Maybe a plastic bag, or you put something in your mouth to give it a bit of leverage for your hands or something like that. And I think those who sew, I've done a little bit of sewing, more crocheting and knitting. Occasionally, you might put a fiber in your mouth as you're tying something off with your hands. And as a result, the idea being, if you do that activity for a long period of time, say many years in your life, especially if you're a professional and that is your profession, there's a potential for that activity, if it's done in the same place or fairly close by, that it can start to leave these markers. And so one of the activity-induced dental modifications we see are these notches that form within the teeth. And we tend to think that that's from putting fibers there, or even things like sewing needles or something like that within the mouth. We see it quite a bit in professional climbers, for those who climb and do a lot of climbing. You can see the rope and cordage that they'll put in their mouth and it makes sense. So you're using your hands quite a bit, and your feet. You don't oftentimes have the ability to use both hands simultaneously. And so the mouth becomes a really important third hand or extra sort of appendage in those cases for severe climbing, to where you might be putting cordage or things in your mouth temporarily as you're positioning and something like that. So
Yeah, I hadn't even thought about rock climbing. That is so true. The thing, I think the one that I'm most familiar with is because I kind of quote unquote grew up anthropologically in the Tidewater. It's pipe facets.
oh, interesting. Yes.
So people will put pipes in their mouth and they clench
Totally.
it between their teeth, and they get these like perfect circles
Yeah.
from clenching the pipe. And we'd see them in children as young as like 8, 9,
Sure.
which is crazy.
Wild. Yeah.
But yeah, no, it's super cool. Like you stick enough stuff in your mouth, like your teeth, your teeth wear away.
Yeah, and you could maybe make the argument that we sort of deal with this in a sense aesthetically in our society with staining, right? This idea of staining. When I go, let's say, to my dental hygienist, they'll look and say, "I see a bit of staining here," and I say, "Yes, coffee, tea, beer, wine, I have those things. They're probably going to stain." Like those are activities that I participate in culturally that are making physical ramifications on my body or my enamel in that case. But they could be more physical as well. Like you said, with the pipe stem, fishing communities, you tend to see it quite a bit as well with any sort of netting that is used. Even more contemporary fly fishers or something like that, if they're doing it enough, you might start to see that. So
what do they put in their mouths?
I've, at least when I go fishing, I'll sometimes put hook or line or things like that in the mouth while I'm tying something off.
I've never fished.
And I would say I don't do the more traditional coastal style net fishing that you would see. And that's where you tend to see a ramp up in activity into dental modifications in the mouth. But there's just a tremendous array of behaviors that can leave these physical markers and modifications within the teeth themselves.
So, okay, yes. And then, so one of the other things I wanted to talk to you, and just for listeners, in case they want to look up the article, it's called Evidence for Teeth as Tools and Palliative Oral Hygiene at Late Medieval Villamagna. I had to read my messy handwriting. One of the things that you mentioned that I had not thought about until reading this article was oral hygiene.
Yeah.
In not now.
Yeah, totally.
So what would oral hygiene have looked like in a late medieval village? Yeah,
so this is a notoriously tricky question. And this is something that the last article we were talking about before the show gets into quite a bit, is trying to really frame what that would have looked like.
Sorry, listeners, I'm just going to pause you just for 1 second. We've already decided that we're going to do a whole nother episode about this one article. It's a biocultural approach to mouths in the medieval era, and I'm very, very excited to do it. So I guess just hold on to your hats, because that's going to come eventually. Please continue.
Yeah, so it's notoriously tricky, I think, because we tend to think that oral hygiene and dentistry, as we know it, starts in the 17th century, really, 18th, 17th century in France. But if you try to go before that, we have really good evidence that Egyptian, from iconography and from physical remains, implemented some form of oral hygiene, whether that's actual brushing techniques or some sort of palliative care, like trying to relieve pain with some sort of herbal poultice application or something like that, or even something like a cavity filling or a bridge that would try to make teeth more straight. We see these things in the medieval period as well. It's just hard for it to preserve. So in our case, in that particular article, what we saw using both macroscopic, and it started with the macroscopic, I saw this particular premolar that looked like it had a very odd sort of tubular groove running along the root structure where there was coinciding with a very large cavity. And it turns out that the socket that tooth was embedded in, the alveolar socket, had a tremendous amount of gum disease just based on the sort of microarchitecture going on either side of the socket. And there was abscessing in different parts of the mouth as well in the adjacent areas. And so when I started to look at the literature, I started to see that, well, if you look at this particular tubular groove, depending on how it's oriented, and if you see it under a high-powered scanning electron microscope, you might see evidence of these striations that go parallel to the groove. They're in the floor of the groove, but they kind of go in the same direction that the groove is facing, almost like a channel. And sure enough, we took the tooth, put it under our scanning electron microscope, and saw a lot of those striations. And frankly, there's a tremendous amount of literature on this. I had no idea. There's a lot of debate on what these tubes are, how they form, et cetera. But a lot of people have come to the consensus that it can be a product of incessant tooth picking. That is, picking the same area repeatedly with some sort of implement. Now, whether that's a twig or something else is hard to know. That's the issue archaeologically we often deal with, right? Is we're not going to preserve often the remains of something like a toothpick directly with the skeleton, right? Think about you guys, if you're using a toothpick or floss, it's probably not going with you, into the grave or the crematorium or something like that. And so this is just one of those things that we don't have what that implement maybe was. We can get an idea roughly of its size, and this would have taken years to form, or at least a lot of repeated behavior to form it in such a manner. And so that's where we're trying to look at it from some of the biological remains, from the skeletal and dental remains, is trying to look at it that way. But there's a tremendous amount of textual evidence as well if you start to look for it. And that's really what that last article tries to deal with, is what is the textual evidence for oral hygiene in the Middle Ages?
Yes. So this is another kind of activity induced like modification to the teeth that isn't necessarily anything to do with activities as you normally, when people hear the word activities, I think they think stuff like fishing or sewing or whatever.
Sure.
This is still an activity induced change. It's just the activity is someone trying to remove something or scratch their teeth or do whatever it is.
Yeah, the idea we put forward in that case was that this was probably to alleviate pain. It's hard to test that, I can't exactly test that.
Actually, can you explain what an abscess is?
Yeah, and so this is another one of those fun rabbit holes. So we oftentimes use the term abscess, and I would say I'm using it quite colloquially here. In the literature, probably better term to use would be periapical inflammation. Now that sounds really jargony, right? But what it means is it's peri, around the apical foramen, which is the sort of bottom portion of the root where your nerves enter into, and blood vessels to innervate the inner dentin portion of the tooth.
And a foramen just means hole.
Yeah, exactly.
That's what foramen means. Yeah.
So the apical foramen is this whole periapical inflammation, meaning we have some form of inflammation going on around this region where the blood vessels are entering the root of the tooth. Okay. That's a sort of safer category and term to use, because it could be abscesses, it could be something like a granuloma, it could be a cyst, it could be a variety of things that are somewhat related in what we see skeletally. And that's what's really hard when it comes to bones. We oftentimes are getting the tip of the iceberg effect. We're only getting a physical manifestation, and bones and teeth can only respond in a very stereotypical fashion oftentimes to a myriad of different stressors or diseases. And so when we look at something like an abscess, what we really mean is, in that case, is that you've had infection go on in this area, typically at the root, that will then grow enough to where it becomes necrotic. That is, it's eating away at a lot of the neighboring bone. You might even have pus formation. It facilitates a drainage of pus that is then going to be in an inundated mass of inflammatory cells, and you're going to start to have eating away at all the neighboring bone. And what we see, at least skeletally, when we classify it as periapical inflammation, is this large sort of necrotic cavity, not on the tooth necessarily itself, but in the neighboring bone, especially where the root would have probably been situated originally in situ, or originally in the mouth.
Yeah, they often look like windows. And this is where I have to compliment you and your other toothy colleagues, which is that, as usual, I don't understand why all of you have beautiful pictures. You always have beautiful, and you have beautiful pictures in all of your articles. So if you're curious what this looks like, you can look this up. I'll leave a link in the show notes. It was very easy to find all of your stuff for free.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, of course. That's what we're trying to do.
But yeah, so I do strongly encourage you to look up the pictures and take a look, because it is super neat.
There's a lot of debate for whatever reason on abscesses, and I'm still learning more, again, because I didn't come from let's say a strict dental anthropology background. I'm always kind of learning more about what is the consensus on abscess versus granuloma versus cyst versus periapical inflammation. But generally speaking, I think for most of the public, they tend to understand that an abscess is some form of large infection that is creating, and you'll typically see, if it's really bad, facial swelling or something like that needs to get drained. It needs to be treated with antibiotics or something.
Yeah. If you hear the word abscess, you should also kind of think of the word hole. There's a hole somewhere and it's leaking something.
Yeah. Some form of infection, typically, that's creating a hole, a void.
Yep. I have a question too about what about hard food?
Yeah, in terms of what it's doing to the mouth or
and what's it's doing to teeth. Can like eating hard food consistently, can that have an effect on the teeth?
Yeah, so this is not something that I do, but there's a lot of really interesting literature out there on what the texture of food stuff does to the chewing surface of teeth, and what can you maybe even start to describe or even quantify that amount of change. And so what they'll do in these microwear analyses is what you'll often see it called, is where they'll look at the chewing portion of a tooth. Molars are really good for this because we tend to chew on our molars preferentially over our front teeth, right? It's kind of hard to chew a meal on your incisors. But they'll look at those teeth in oftentimes a high form of microscopy. So maybe scanning electron microscopy, maybe something else, and then try to see what's the orientation of grooves or lines, or literally the microwear. What is the damage that's being caused to the enamel at the microscopic level, and how is it oriented? And how do we see, maybe through experimental studies or observational studies on certain species that emphasize hard food stuff versus soft food stuff, so what does that do to the enamel? And I think that's a really fascinating sort of window into food. From what I understand, and again, this is not my realm of expertise, it tends to be pretty general, if you want to be on the safe side, that this is more harder foodstuffs, this is softer foodstuffs. It gets really hard to pin down what that was, right? Was it a nut? Was it something, seeded? In our case, the medieval period, we have a tremendous amount of dental wear, at least at our site. That is, they're chewing the living crap out of these molars a lot of times. And whether or not they are just masticating a lot, whether they're just chewing, or is it because, and this is what a lot of us tend to think, it's probably a bit of the result of the grinding process. That is, how does grindstone and the coarseness of grindstone start to maybe get, incorporated into the food stuff that then makes it a bit grittier?
Right. So like if you're grinding wheat or barley or whatever, little pieces of stone, tiny microscopic pieces of stone end up in there, and that can wear down on your teeth. And this is also something that I really encourage people to take a look at. There's definitely online resources where you can see people's teeth in the past. The amount of wear on like a 30 or 40-year-old's teeth is insane. Like they have the mouths of what would be like 80-year-olds now. It's crazy.
Yeah, and there's a lot of variability. Some sites I've seen people have worked on, even in the medieval period, and they just seem to have softer foodstuffs in that region. And as a result, their teeth, even if they're roughly contemporaneous time-wise with the site I'm looking at in the later medieval period, their teeth look, their 30-year-olds have like close to, quote, perfect teeth, or at least they're all there with minimal wear. Ours, for whatever reason, seem to have a tremendous amount of teeth being lost before death. Even if you reach 30 or 40, you might already have 3 or 4 teeth gone, and a lot of dental wear that is being worn down to the point where enamel is no longer there. Most of the cases I looked at, in older individuals especially, either they have very few teeth at all left, maybe a couple, their molars are very likely to be gone. You're basically left with your front teeth to chew on. And if the molars are there, a lot of times, the enamel's gone. Imagine just chewing so much that your enamel's completely gone and you're just down to your dentin. And that's oftentimes what we tend to see. And dentin's really cool. It can actually, when the enamel's no longer present, it seems to have some really, it can kind of buff up its resistance at a local level there. It can kind of try to compensate for the fact that enamel's not there at the surface level, but it will definitely start to grind down even faster than enamel will typically.
And I can't imagine that that feels great.
This is one of the ideas, yeah, is how do we start to think about how does food's texture and food stuff start to affect the sensory experience as well, right? Think about how much, I think in our daily lives, you have something that just seems a bit too cold or a bit too hot and how that makes your teeth feel. Or if you were to ever wear down your enamel or especially your dentin enough, you might start to hit that actual foramen, that apical foramen we were talking about, right? That hole with the blood vessels will start to show on the upper portion of the tooth underneath your crown. Now, normally it's protected underneath a cap of enamel and then the dentin there. But if you start to wear it down enough, that's where you can start to have pulp infection that starts to ramp up even faster. So,
And then you know what happens? Abscesses.
and then you could get to your abscesses. So this is where things get really related. I like to think of it as a sort of reciprocity of the mouth. That is, the foodstuffs that you eat throughout your life are going to influence your teeth and mouth such that over the course of your life, what teeth are left from all that food stuff are going to influence the foods you can eat later on, if that makes sense. It can start to become very related, right? If you have, in our case, in this very rural, agrarian, medieval context with probably a lot of micro grit being incorporated into the flours and the diet, you start to see people lose a lot of teeth and wear down their teeth to nubs, by the time they're middle or older age. By the time you get even older than that, you don't maybe have much, if any, teeth left. You're probably not going to be able to eat that same gritty food stuff that you were when you were younger. So maybe things switch to a more gruel-like consistency, or I think cream of wheat or some oatmeal or something like that. That's a little more liquidy so that you don't have to chew as much. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
So
totally. Yeah, no, this is really interesting. And see, this is what I mean too, is like we've talked a lot about microscopic teeth. We haven't talked that much about like macroscopic teeth. And like the truth is, like, you look at archaeological skulls and the whole tooth situation is nuts. Like, it's crazy. And I think that people really, at least in kind of this industrialized, fairly wealthy country, like, people really take teeth for granted in a way that we could not in the past. And even in some areas in the United States, like I grew up right near Appalachia, like there's some serious dental disease that still occurs. So anyway, this is a very long way of saying I'm very grateful for my teeth.
yeah, and I think, there's a tremendous respect that I have for dentists and oral healthcare, in terms of what it provides people. And the mouth is really related to the body. What's bizarre, I think, about the United States, and I don't know how many listeners are US or not, but if you're outside of the US, you might not know that here in the US, we have dental insurance and health insurance, and they are separate. And they have pretty much always been separate. And the history of that is a fascinating one, and maybe not something we want to get into, but it has ramifications today on the way we conceptualize teeth as somehow separate and the mouth separate from the rest of the body in terms of treatment and care. And that factors into a lot of inequalities that we see from a public health perspective, even today.
Yeah, 100%. I think one of the things that can happen too when you have these abscesses, when you have all of these infections happening in the mouth, that can actually just kill you. That
Yes.
transfers from dental health insurance to actual health insurance, like not that slowly, to be honest. There's like a very famous example of a man who came over in Jamestown, Virginia, and he had a dental infection that traveled up to his brain and killed him. And that's like not, it's just very beautifully preserved, which is why it's like top of mind for me, but it's not an unusual story either.
Yeah. Yeah. So to build on that, one of the interesting things that I think, and this is where I guess I see the anthropology coming in, is that it's not just the archaeological teeth, although that's my specialty and that's what I really like to look at. It's trying to think about teeth in the past and even teeth in oral health and healthcare, and how things like that can inform our understanding of oral healthcare today, or how can we take an anthropological approach to to mouths and teeth and oral health care, even in our society today. And to piggyback on the individual you were mentioning, there was a particularly awful tragedy in the 2000s with Diamante Driver. His family was on Medicaid, a poor African-American family, and they received primary health care through their pediatrician, but no primary care dentist. Again, we tend to have a bifurcation of healthcare versus dental care. The mother reached out to a number of dentists who said they offer Medicaid. In fact, 27 of them, but none of them seemed to provide treatment. When it push came to shove, he started to have a tremendous amount of tooth pain, and it seemed to be abscessing. Cavity spreads, gets into the sinuses, eventually into the brain, has to go into the ER and receive 2 brain surgeries with accompanying seizures. The treatment cost was north of $250,000 when the extraction of that tooth would have been less than $80 at most clinics. And so the cost was tremendous, and really tragically, Diamante Driver died in 2007 as a result of this cavity infection spreading through the sinuses into his brain. And so the mouth and body are incredibly linked. And one of the things that we try to think about looking at archaeological teeth is just how linked that probably was as well. For those who had cavities and things like abscesses or infections, there would have been probably a tremendous amount of pain and discomfort and treatment sought.
Yeah. And I think one of the things that, again, if you're privileged enough like I have been, that you just don't really think of, like, if you do have dental pain and you do have access to a dentist, you're like, oh, gosh darn it, like, this is annoying. I've never been in a position where I'm like, this dental pain could be life-threatening.
Yeah.
You know?
Right.
And that was something that was unfortunately apparently not atypical now, but was definitely even more normal in the medieval era.
Yeah, right. And this is where I think things get really interesting in terms of what did treatment look like, right? Your question about what treatment, it's hard to know. One of the biggest ideas is that the local blacksmith in a rural village or area, maybe like Villamagna or many other medieval contexts, that in an agrarian setting, your blacksmith may have doubled as your dentist in that they helped extract teeth because they had the biggest irons, you know? So
I don't know. I don't know if you've ever hung out with horse dentists, but
no, I
like
have not.
all of their tools, they do look like blacksmith's tools. Like
Sure.
it's crazy.
Yeah.
Horse dentists. This is another thing that you just don't think about, but
Fascinating.
that's a thing. Okay, so I did actually want to talk about another one of your papers that was kind of like more of a macroscopic view on teeth.
Sure.
It's called Making Sense of Medieval Mouths, Investigating Sex Differences of Dental Pathological Lesions in a Late Medieval Italian Community. So, okay, I had not realized, first of all, I learned so much. And this is one of the really cool things about biological anthropology that I try and stress on every show, is that you get to learn about so many different things to do what you're doing. Like, you get to like really dig into like whatever the cutting edge of biology is in your field. And then you also get to look at historic stuff. Super, super neat. And then of course you're bringing in like the bioarchaeological perspective. All of that to say, I did not realize that there is this idea that women get more cavities than men.
Yeah. It's a pretty prevalent sort of, I don't know if I'd call it a theory, but at least a hypothesis, a model, let's say, for a model, an explanatory model for maybe what's going on. It really sort of pervades into popular culture as well. There's a number of these larger popular culture ideas of, for every baby you lose a tooth, is like an old saying or proverb, and how really the idea of females, and what I'll talk about here is in terms of biological sex, is that females are more prone to cavities by virtue of hormonal differences that occur as a result of menopause or childbirth and childbearing. That's sort of the crux of a lot of the argument.
I will say my sister-in-law did lose some teeth on her third pregnancy.
Yeah.
Apparently babies like suck calcium out of you.
There's this sort of notion of the mineral sapping, right? Like you're sapping all these minerals. You have to create, leach a tremendous amount.
I'm saying this to you, and I don't even know if it's true.
It's challenging. So some of the work that we did, not related to the teeth, but somewhat similarly, was this notion of osteoporosis, right? And that's what my advisor, Dr. Agarwal, worked quite a bit on. And it gets into this idea of how much do children really leach in an, let's say, a clinical setting. That's probably where you're going to get the best information, right? Is trying to understand. The problem is this: is the modern contemporary Western woman in the United States the best model or the litmus test for how we should understand variation in being female throughout time and space? Probably not. And they certainly are probably not indicative of what our early evolutionary environment was in that regard. And so what we tend to see there is a lot more pregnancies but also a lot more on demand and truly on demand breastfeeding. That is consistent breastfeeding, not more partial breastfeeding. And so we might see in the cases of certain portions of the skeleton, yes, we might see some resorption of bone as a result of the pregnancy, but there seems to be a rebound after birth during breastfeeding and other sorts of behaviors that seem to help almost play a regenerative role in that regard. But with teeth, things are a bit more different. And what the argument for a lot of the teeth is maybe not the minerals and enamel being sucked to create a baby or something like that, leached off to create a baby, but that the salivary environment, that is the oral ecological sort of milieu that of the mouth that teeth are embedded in, is going to vary across, between the sexes.
So this was another thing I did not know, having never been pregnant, and also none of my 8 million currently pregnant friends have told me. Apparently, when you're pregnant, you dry up. You stop producing as much saliva. I did not know that dry mouth was a symptom of pregnancy.
Yeah, and this is where things get really interesting.
And also, I didn't know that saliva protected your teeth. I mean, I guess it makes sense, but I didn't know.
Yeah, there was an old salivary researcher. I don't even know what to call someone who studies saliva. I suppose salivary researcher, I think Erwin Mandel in 1990, who said, I'm editorializing here because I don't remember the exact quote, but it was something to the effect of, saliva lacks the emotional appeal of tears and the hard workness of sweat, or something like that, the sincerity of sweat, something to that effect, right? Is this idea that saliva just doesn't get respected as a really important fluid, way that that we talk about blood, we talk as this sort of like, and metaphors around blood. We talk about sweat. You put my sweat into it, sweat equity, but we don't really use that for saliva as much.
It's a Rodney Dangerfield of bodily fluids.
Yeah, sure.
For my younger listeners, which is probably most of you at this point, that was a comedian that would say, I don't get no respect. If he's problematic, I apologize. That is the only thing I know about him.
Yeah, here it is. Saliva lacks the drama of blood, the sincerity of sweat, and the emotional appeal of tears.
Yeah. Yeah. And so I never really thought about saliva, but this does make sense, because I know that people who sleep with their mouths open tend to have a lot more dental problems, and that's because it's all dry in there.
Yeah, there's a tremendous amount of complexity we've learned from saliva. And so one of the things that saliva does is it's very active in what dentists, especially dental researchers, will call the remineralization demineralization cycle, or oftentimes abbreviated Riemann-Demin, kind of Riemann-Demin cycle. And that's how saliva helps bring in things like calcium and phosphorus into teeth to remineralize them when acids are trying to actively demineralize them. And we're often getting acids from our foodstuffs or any sort of exposure. Soda is probably one of the better ones you can think of, just because it's high sugar, high acidity, but other things as well. Even sort of the byproducts of acids from eating a lot of starchy carbohydrates, for example. And so saliva can, and I'll just list some here, help with antibacterial, antifungal, antiviral. It helps with remineralization. It acts as a lubricant, right? Think about even just trying to keep your teeth from maybe sticking together, having a small amount of saliva there. The mucin content really helps there. And tremendously important in taste and digestion. That is, people with zinc deficiencies seem to actually have far less taste capabilities of the same foods when they don't have zinc deficiencies. And so the amount of zinc present, among other things, seems to actually be directly related to your perception of taste. And if you've never thought of it that way, think of any time you've ever, sort of, my mouth is watering, I guess is one of those good analogies you could think of, or had something spicy. You can have an immediate sort of secretion of saliva as a result of that stimulant. And so saliva becomes really important for digestion, because the amylase in saliva will help break food down. And then you have to make it into what we call a bolus, or something that is actually capable of being swallowed. If it's too dry, it can get stuck.
Yeah.
And so we want to lubricate that and make sure that it gets formed into small enough bolus so it can be digested.
So wait, what is this? Is the zinc in saliva?
Yeah, it's part of the saliva. I think it's zinc, water, and gustin, or gustin,
oh.
I might be saying that wrong, are part of the sort of taste apparatus in terms of saliva and its importance.
That is so cool. So also, side note, listeners, if you do go and read this article, I spent the entire time like kind of salivating inappropriately, because the more you think about your spit and saliva, the more like you generate, which is like, it's a feature of saliva. Like if you think about like food and like you don't even have to have a donut in front of you. Like you start salivating.
Totally.
Apparently it also works when you just read about saliva.
I think about that. I don't know if it happens to you, but I've definitely had that with like breathing or heart rate, like articles or any sort of literature where they're like, oh, like most breathing is very, autonomic, or you're not even noticing it's happening. And then suddenly you start to say that, I'm like, now I'm paying attention to my breathing. Now, it's
Am I breathing enough?
Am I breathing weird? Am I breathing right? Did I hit the number they said I should or something like that? I've definitely had that happen.
Oh my God. The other thing that it always happens to me with is when I'm reading about like parasite articles, especially anything that's like lice
sure.
or anything like that. Like I just get so itchy. So anyway, just be prepared to drool over this research.
That's great. That's a great plug. Thank you.
So in theory, there is this hypothesized difference that women have more cavities. That's kind of like an interchangeable thing.
And antemortem tooth loss seems to be related in there as well. That is losing your teeth before death.
So there's two hypotheses for why this might happen. One is sex-related dietary differences. So like women might be eating more starchy foods, which produce more acid, which can demineralize the teeth, and that leads to more caries. And then the other one is the one that we've discussed, which is like the reproductive ecology of women. Like it causes differences in saliva, and like you end up losing teeth down the road. So those are the two main hypotheses for why this exists. But like what you did was you went into this archaeological collection and you're like, is there even a difference in cavities and caries? Like is an antemortem tooth loss, like the lesions, the periapical lesions that you were talking about? Like, so what did you find? Were there differences?
Yeah, it's somewhat complex. And so I would say there are these sort of two general models. And I would say that the dietary one is the one that's typically employed, is maybe the right word, the most by most of bioarchaeology. That is, when we're looking at differences in cavities, especially between, let's say, males and females at a particular site, it's often interpreted, well, there may be some gender dietary differences going on there that helps explain some of that variability, just like you said. The saliva one, I don't, at least in my sort of research, hasn't been used as much. It's not as pervasive in the literature, but I think it's super interesting. And I think what we really tried to get to at the end was, we got to be careful and maybe look at both of them, because a lot of dietary papers won't necessarily look at saliva, or some of the saliva papers sort of ignore diet, or foodstuffs. And it's really tricky to try to figure out how maybe they're both playing together, especially because food and saliva are sort of intertwined, like we were talking about, right? In terms of sense and taste and secretion and all these things. So what we seem to see, at least at this site with our sample, which wasn't large, I will totally admit that. We don't have a tremendous amount of individuals. This is part of the challenge of a lot of bioarchaeology. One of our decisions going into this project with my mentors and collaborators at the time was that we really wanted to try to do these analyses within a sort of chronological parameter. That is, we have a number of skeletons from the site over a larger period of time, but we wanted to try to narrow it down time-wise so that we can try to control a bit better what we think they ate, the sort of temporal dimensions of when these people would have lived roughly contemporaneously with one another, and a better understanding of what the food and agrarian society was like then in agriculture. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So we could have increased the sample size, but at the cost of resolution time-wise. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So the reason I'm like kind of smile laughing here silently is because I have had quite a few evolutionary anthrobiologists on the show whose sample size is 1.
Yep.
Would you like to tell people what your sample size is?
So in this case, we were looking at teeth. And so I'm looking here, we have, 900, let's say, female teeth against 881 male teeth. That's pretty small for looking at something like antemortem tooth loss. And
so sorry, also, how many individuals is that?
Individuals, yeah. So this would have been, I think, 36 and 35 or something like that. So around 30 individuals for each, which is really small. Again, I'm not going to say that this is a smoking gun for which model is right by any means, but I think it's been interesting to explore. And I've carried some of the same analyses we've done here with subsequent work I've worked at elsewhere. Let's say in my dissertation research, I looked at a larger sample in Portugal with much larger numbers, but with the same kind of approach. But what we seem to see here, which is really interesting, is that there were no differences. When you do a traditional statistical comparison of cavities between males and females, whether you're looking at the younger females, the older females and males, or even lumped together, just total the amount of total males and females. But when we implement a correction factor, that is trying to estimate the amount of cavities adjusted for how many teeth were lost antemortem, then we start to see that the males had more cavities. Now, why would this be? Well, part of the issue is that we can just oftentimes what we do is look at the crude prevalence of cavities. That is, we'll look at how many teeth are observable there in a mouth and how many of them have cavities, right? Usually we have 32 teeth, right? That's the kind of standard number. So out of 32 roughly possible, how many of those have cavities, right? That would be the general idea. And let's say how many, we could compare your amount versus my amount and then sort of scale that up for a whole community or population or something like that. But the problem starts to get, well, what happens when they've lost a lot of the teeth already by the time the archaeologist or bioarchaeologist has seen them? So what happens when antemortem tooth loss rates are really high? And potentially as a result of cavities, removing those teeth, whether extraction or they've been lost or weaken the gum line or something like that, right? So then you're probably underrepresenting the true cavities rate when you're only looking at the ones you're observing, because there's a lot that you don't ever see. And so there's some different forms of trying to adjust for how you calculate how many cavities would have been there given the amount of teeth that are lost ante-mortem. That's the general gist. And there's some different formula you can use. But once we implemented one of those correction factors, at least we saw in our analyses that there were actually more cavities. So that is male in males. So that is males exhibited more cavities than females once you accounted for the fact that males also had quite a bit more antemortem tooth loss than their female counterparts.
That's really interesting. And it doesn't line up with what kind of the ideas that are going around say that one might expect. One of the things that I thought was very clever and interesting was that you also did an isotopic analysis of potential dietary sources for both of them. And this is something that has been discussed pretty extensively on the show. So if you want to learn more about isotopes, very easy to do that with this show. The high level overview is an isotope is an atom that has a different number of neutrons. And so like you can have carbon-13 or carbon-12 and nitrogen 15.
Yeah, it'll usually be carbon. You'll typically see the biplot that we often see in our field is carbon-13 versus nitrogen 15 and 15. Delta N15 and delta C13.
Yeah. So yeah, and like different plants. So this is like very, very relevant in the New World, especially because it's like corn versus wheat. Like the difference is like very, very extreme. But like you can also use nitrogen, especially like for animals or like understanding marine resources in like the food web there. But yeah, so you can basically use it to get a rough idea. It's not the same as like looking at whatever's trapped in the dental calculus, but it can give you a pretty good idea of like roughly what has a person been eating compared to another person.
Yeah, and a lot of it's used at sometimes individual level if you have a good resolution and good preservation and maybe the money to do a lot of sampling across different parts of the skeleton. Other times it'll be a more sample approach. That is, they'll look at maybe a large amount of individuals buried in one portion of the site and compare them to the other portion. And a lot of those comparisons might be done at a more aggregate level, like you said, between different photosynthetic plant pathways, something like corn being C4 versus other plants being C3, or looking at the trophic positioning for different animals. That is, how do predators tend to have elevated or enriched nitrogen versus maybe something like herbivores or something like that, and then try to see where humans kind of fit into the food web in relation to all of that.
Yeah, so it's just like a clever thing that bioarchaeologists do on a regular basis, and it's something that you used here too, right? You're like, were there dietary differences? Because it's like great to be like, maybe dietary differences account for this, but then like say like, well, were there any? And that was also something you looked at.
Yeah, and this is something that I'll say, I didn't do any of the isotopic analyses myself. This was done by Eric and Nietzsche back in the 2000s as part of this larger Villamagna sort of study monograph that came out. And I was very thankful that she had done that because it helped contextualize a lot of our data and our data to come in other publications as well. And so there did seem to be some degree of dietary differences, but whether or not they would have manifested in something that we see at the tooth level, it can be difficult to say. And so this is where I think things can get really interesting. What we seem to see at Villamagna generally is fairly unchanged food practices for the roughly, I think, 8 centuries of occupation and sampling that was done. meaning that the food sort of seemed to stay pretty consistent for almost 800 years and seemed to also be a bit lower in terms of nitrogen, or maybe emphasize potentially more plant remains in some cases than many other neighboring regions of Italy when it was compared more regionally at the same time period.
So
So
they were eating more plants compared to.
potentially, yeah, or at least less maybe animal protein, let's say,
Mhm.
was maybe one of those ideas. And so Villamagna compared to other portions of Italy is interesting in its own regard, let alone what's going on over time, which in our case is not a lot of change, in the case of the medieval period.
So were there dietary differences between males and females?
At the isotopic level, there were some in the late medieval period. And it seemed that in some cases, males had higher nitrogen than their female counterparts. So maybe more access to protein. Now, how that would have came about is hard to say. This is where things get really tricky. Is it a gender difference in foodstuffs? What's being allocated where? Is it maybe the men are traveling to other nearby regions and getting access to maybe fish or some sort of marine protein that maybe females who stayed more local to the area maybe didn't get access to? Is it intentional abstaining from meat in the case of maybe rural female behaviors? And we've seen this in other parts of the medieval period as well, of female fasting and abstinence from meat as a religious observance. So there's a lot of different potential explanations. I don't even know if we'll ever get the resolution to be able to understand which of those. It's probably a mix, but there seems to be at least some degree of difference that maybe explains some of our data.
So yeah, I think overall it's a really interesting study because you looked at a lot of different perspectives. You found something that was kind of counter to what was expected. I think that this is one of the real challenges of science communication is that people want like really clear cut, like pretty bow wrapped on top articles that have like these sweeping generalizations that you can make. And this article is like a classic, like, there's a lot of stuff going on and we learn stuff and it's good that we learn stuff, but like, I can't tell you exactly what's going on at the end of the day, but here's some ideas for what might be going on.
Yeah.
And I think that's beautiful.
Totally. I mean, I think where my thinking is right now, and it could change, but I think my thinking is that for a long period of time, I think bioarchaeology organized itself statistically to try to replicate what goes on in public health. That is, a lot of the statistical analyses that are carried out, or an analyses and framework for how it's done, doing this comparative, I'll compare the males versus females or this or that, is very reminiscent of public health, in terms of trying to understand disease and patterning and things like that. The problem is we're doing retrospective analyses. That is, we're looking at populations that we don't have a case control group. We're looking at populations that have already lived and died. Our samples are pretty skewed and somewhat biased in terms of their mortality sample, not a perfect cross-cut of the living community. We don't necessarily know their age or their sex. We can estimate, and we've gotten some techniques that have helped with that quite a bit, but a lot of times they're an estimation. And so we have like sort of problem after problem after problem, or caveat, I should say, layered, to where I think when you're doing anything in the past with an archaeological perspective, it's good to explore and posit that this is probably going to be pretty messy to ever suss out really neatly, if that makes sense, especially in terms of things like aggregate levels of disease.
Yeah. And this is also something that I've talked about a lot on the show. I don't know if I've mentioned it recently, which is that a lot of times, like I said, people want, for example, nature versus nurture. People act like it's one or the other.
Yeah.
It's in reality almost never one or the other. So like for as many hypotheses you have in general, like there's probably some truth to a lot of them. Sorry, I was just thinking about all of the hypotheses for bipedalism in humans, and there's some truly wild ones out there.
The aquatic ape is one of my favorites. I teach students, right? Like, that's one of the funny ones. Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
But that's one of those ones that's always tricky, right? And I teach that with students with, we have this idea from traditional science modeling that hypotheses, your null and alternative should be mutually exclusive hypotheses that help support the larger scientific endeavor. Things get really tricky when you're trying to do that, I think, in the past, and there's probably some selective forces that are like this, and some that are going the other way. And I guess that's where things can get really tricky. I find the salivary sort of model is not necessarily mutually exclusive to the dietary one. It just tends to be, what do people emphasize as an explanatory variable for the variation that they're observing in their data, right? And I think there are ways in which we should consider saliva. And a lot of what we tried to do there was say, look, saliva is really important, clearly, and this is something we should think about. But what are the problems? Well, the salivary glands don't typically preserve in most bioarchaeological contexts, maybe a couple mummy cases, but for the most part, skeletal remains do not preserve the parotid gland, so we can't really understand this person's saliva. Saliva flow varies tremendously within an individual throughout the day. Like you said, maybe people who sleep in certain ways or think about certain foods or reading, there's a tremendous amount of variation even therein within an individual within a day. And so these are all really difficult things that even salivary researchers are trying to control for, and we're trying to do that in skeletal remains. I just don't think it's going to happen at that resolution.
Yeah.
And so you have to be okay with that bit of murkiness, I suppose, at the end.
That's the exciting bit, is the murkiness.
To me, yeah, absolutely. It's that kind of continued interest in what could be, I suppose. And you want to be, I think the scientific component is very important. You want to be rigorous. You want to try to do the best sort of analysis you can, frame the hypotheses ahead of time, don't do it post hoc. Like, all these things are really important, but it also means that we have to be willing to acknowledge that this is archaeological data, and as a result, it's going to be very messy compared to some of our other maybe peers or colleagues in different disciplines.
Yeah. And again, another shout out to any undergraduates out there. Math is good. You should learn math. It'll make your life a lot easier if you want to go to grad school.
I sure wish I had taken more. And all my, funnily enough, I was not at all trying to stab at public health. I love public health. I have a lot of colleagues in public health. My statistics classes were in public health. And then I realized when I started working with archaeological data, I was like, dang, this is hard. There's some components that are really amazing to maybe port over or adapt, for archaeological context, and other ones where I cannot do a case control study the way,
yeah, I
this
mean,
would be done.
And the thing is, even with public health studies, like, there's still problems. There are still
totally
so many problems, which that's an episode probably for a different podcast, to be honest.
Yeah, totally.
But it's definitely interesting. Okay, I do want to be respectful of your time. I was going to ask you about kind of like your field work. Like, what did that look like? Was that something that you enjoyed? I mean, I feel like it's kind of crazy saying like, hey, did you like going to a town near Rome and spending some time in the Italian countryside? But maybe you hated it.
No, I definitely did not. I felt very, very privileged. I would say it's funny, I saw that you interviewed Dr. David Braun. He was my field school head back when I did my field school as an undergraduate myself many years back in northern Kenya. And that was amazing. And I had never really at the time when I did the field school think I would pivot to something more bioarchaeological. But by virtue of coursework and getting exposed to it, I sort of fell in love with this complexity of trying to understand behavior in the skeleton. And it's a really good nexus for that nature versus nurture to be dismantled, right, is looking at bones and teeth, because you can see behavior and growth and development all intertwined with our biology and our body, which I loved. And so when this project came about and going to Rome, it was so different than what my field exposure was, because for the most part, these were all previously excavated remains. And so what we were doing was working at the University at Sapienza in Rome, thanks to our colleagues there who hosted us. And we just had a sort of a lab space carved out during the summers and would go and work when there weren't classes being offered, so that we can analyze this large quantity of remains.
Yeah, it's more like a field lab work more than anything else.
It is. And that got me exposed to something I, as an undergrad, had never really been exposed to, which is this idea of, there's a lot of human skeletal remains and other archaeological artifacts in museum context, or in some cases, not even in museum context, in municipal museums or even municipal storage facilities, that sometimes want people to come do research on them. And I had always sort of grown up or assumed, well, you have to go out and do your own sort of excavation or field work. That's part of the professionalization. And this was my first window into realizing that there's a lot of material out there that lacks people who really want to do more detailed analyses. And that takes time. And so I had a lot of fun getting to do this project. It showed me a lot about how to do sort of legacy collections or previously excavated collections research. And that's actually what I ended up doing for my dissertation later in Portugal, was with a similar sort of collection, because they had a lot of material, but not a lot of people who were doing more systematic analyses in the ways that we had chatted about through our collaboration. And so I really loved it. I mean, gosh, so hard being in Rome, right?
It's
the food was incredible. The site's incredible. It's some of my fondest memories ever. We're being there.
it's funny because I normally ask people like, what's one thing that you tell that you like you really can't live without in the field? And I've gotten all kinds of answers like, don't forget to bring an extra pair of glasses. And every time someone says something like that, it's like it comes with a story about like some horrible thing that happened.
Yeah, yeah.
And it's like, I don't know. What's one thing that you shouldn't go to Rome
I know. I
without?
feel like I'm cheating because it's like, oh,
No,
don't bring a pair of pants that might be a little bigger because after all the amazing food, you might have to like switch into them or something. Would be my answer.
no, but it is true that is definitely it's like it's a very different form of field work, and it is field work like you're not at your home lab or whatever, but it's definitely a different type of thing than what people typically think of when they think of field work.
Totally.
And yeah, bioarchaeologists do sometimes dig stuff up, but I would not say that's the vast majority of how they spend their time.
At least in my work, I've worked predominantly in Europe. My collaborators and colleagues, especially in the Mediterranean, they have so much stuff, like because they have so much occupation, right? Historical occupation of cities in the same geographical space for thousands of years. And cemeteries have been put there for thousands of years. So any sort of subsurface construction or anything that goes on is fairly likely to hit something archaeologically significant, if not burials or cemetery complexes. And so as a result, they oftentimes can't just leave them there because it might be something very pertinent, like putting in new sewage or putting in new infrastructure or foundation for a new building for the municipality or something like that. So they have to excavate oftentimes these remains. And then where do they go? Do you try to rebury them? Do they go to storage? Maybe the analysis is something the community actually wants or that certain collaborators there want. And so they have a lot of material, but just want people who are interested and will do good work and collaborate directly with them to be able to facilitate that, which I think is great.
Yeah.
So it exposed me to that whole side of things, which I'm a big advocate for now, especially for even undergraduate students that I work with now here at Augustana. I think fieldwork is incredibly important. And I say, like, I'm not trying to say skip it, but also understand that a lot of material actually exists out there in museum context that if you have the right permissions and collaboration potential, then it's not a bad idea to look into.
I will say there are also quite a few field schools in Europe.
Totally.
And I know that inexplicably, I'm not 100% sure why, there are certain communities that live on Facebook, and biological anthropologists, a ton of them are on Facebook. I don't know why, but if you join biological anthropology groups, Facebook groups, a lot of them advertise their field school offerings along with like job offerings and stuff. Yeah. So like if that's something that you're interested in, like I would go ahead. I know it's like, I work with a bunch of Gen Zers and they're like, you're still on Facebook? I'm like, you know who else is on Facebook? All of the horse people. Yeah. So if you want to do anything horse related, you get on Facebook. If you want to do anything biological anthropology related, you get on Facebook. I don't make the rules. That's just where the people are.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I've been bad at this with like, I was thinking about later on where to find stuff. It's like, well, there's, I guess, LinkedIn, but also academia, but also ResearchGate, but also Facebook. There's like so many platforms, and
there's so many platforms. Okay, so let us actually round out the interview. Sure. So first question, if anyone wants to learn more about the kind of work that you do, whether that's like a basic intro to looking at teeth or like your specific work, where is a good place for them to start?
Sure. I think in terms of specific work, I would look at my ResearchGate profile is probably the one I keep most up to date. I also have a LinkedIn and an academia page, but I found that's a three-legged stool that's hard to keep all legs equal. So I tend to put a lot more eggs in the ResearchGate basket recently. So I can send you that link and you can put it in the show notes or something. But I will also answer any messages or something on LinkedIn or elsewhere. I just tend to go on that one more. In terms of teeth, man, there's just so much good stuff out there. I think Tanya Smith's book, Teeth Tales They Tell, that's a great one. One that's maybe more, let's say, public facing and from a museum perspective, especially with a lot of really good images, is called The Smile Stealers. That's a really fun book that looks at the Wellcome Museum's exhibit on teeth and history of teeth and dentistry from a more museological or museology perspective, which I really like. That was a fun book. And then the sort of classic for our work from a research perspective, I would say, is any of Simon Hilson's work on dental anthropology. He's written so much. He's he's sort of one of the de facto experts out there on teeth and dental anthropology as a field. So I think any of his works would be highly recommended as well.
Perfect. And what are you reading for work right now?
Yeah, so there's a couple different things. I think where I'm at Augustana, it's a very teaching focused institution. And so a lot of what I've been doing, and especially as my first year here, is just trying to consume as much different teaching sort of scholarship as I can. So I've been reading Radical Hope by Kevin Gannon, which is a great small book, but it's been a really fun, rich book to go through about teaching in the sort of 21st century, especially now. I've also been reading Augustin Fuentes's Race, Monogamy, and Other Lies They Told You. That's been a fun book, especially I think this is the newer edition, if I'm not mistaken, and looking at, so that's kind of a fun pleasure book, but also for work. It's kind of that fun in between, I find. And then some other scholarship on research that I'm doing that's resulting from my dissertation. And most of that is going to be in the realm of taphonomy. So looking at preservation more specifically. And so a lot of the literature there is focusing on taphonomy and human skeletal remains.
That's really cool. I'm glad that you're reading something about teaching. I think that was, I don't know what it's like now at UNL, but I did definitely feel like I did not get enough of a here's how to teach people thing at all
Sure.
as a grad. I mean, I was a graduate student too, but
Yeah.
like I had their little lives in my hands.
I really think it's a challenge. And I was very lucky. My advisor and many of the faculty at UC Berkeley had a tremendous support network for teaching and pedagogy and trying to develop pedagogy even as a graduate student. It's challenging, right? Because as a graduate student, you're sometimes teaching whatever the faculty is teaching and trying to uphold their sort of pedagogical approach. But at the same time, we had a teaching and resource center on campus, and we had a teaching certificate program that if you took a number of courses and got evaluated and observed by people, you could facilitate that. And I was lucky enough to do that. So I felt very lucky, but I think it's starting to change, but I think it is slow. I think
Yeah.
it is,
I think
it's starting to catch up now, let's say.
people, I think, have very like more recently realized that it is like something that's super important. I think especially with Zoom and the pandemic, like
Yeah,
teaching
totally.
online is like a whole different beast, especially. And I'm glad that it is changing because I did my best, but I also look back at mistakes that definitely could have been avoided if someone had
Sure.
sat down and talked
And
to
I think
me.
we definitely all make a lot of mistakes. In every class you teach, you're like, well, that was a bad idea of an assignment. That's going to always happen. But that's what I like about it is you've never really solved it. You're just always in the kind of
Oh yeah.
perpetual state of
And then
learning,
kids
and I
change
love
over
that.
time too.
Yeah.
Like, yeah, totally.
So that's been fun, and reading books about teaching at a broader sort of maybe pedagogical institutional level, but also trying to find teaching books specific to things like anthropological themes is really fun.
Yeah, totally. And yeah, and so cool. Okay. And then last question is what are you consuming for fun right now? So that can be like books, TV, podcasts. I've had plenty of people say hiking, the
Yeah, I
outdoors.
wish I wish I could say hiking, but the weather here has been a little prohibitive. At least -45, I tend to stay indoors a bit more, but it means I get to read more books, which is great. So I just finished Cixin Liu's Ball Lightning, which is a sci-fi book about a scientist in China trying to do this sort of intense quest, let's say, for understanding and quantifying how to find ball lightning in the natural world, and the sort of ethical dilemmas he comes up against trying to find it when he partners with different military organizations. So that was a good one. He's starting to get the author's getting a lot more buzz right now because Netflix just dropped their trailer for The Three Body Problem, which is based on his famous trilogy series. So the Ball Lightning is not related to that series, but it's somewhat similar in terms of how it's organized and theme and things like that. So, and I loved the Three Body Problem series. I read those, so those were great. So that was one of them, and then I just started up Hyperion by Dan Simmons, which is another sort of classic sci-fi
Yeah.
book. I tend to like a lot of sci-fi books because I think they deal with. I like to see how certain sci-fi authors deal with anthropological themes. That's really my curiosity.
Have you read any of Becky Chambers' stuff?
I'm not. No.
Um,
Any good recommendations?
I feel like you would really like it. Her whole like I haven't read anything from her that I have disliked. Um, I'm reading her new series right now, which is a Psalm for the Wild Built and a Prayer for the Crown Shy, which is just like a little duology,
Hmm.
which is incredible. It's about a society where like one day the robots became sentient and the humans
Mm.
were like, you know what? You're sentient. You should just go off and live your own lives and we won't use you anymore because that's unethical.
Interesting. Yeah.
And they've been separated for hundreds and hundreds of years, maybe thousands. And then one day a robot and a human encounter each other in the wild, in like the wilderness.
Oh, sure.
And they like have these whole like philosophical discussions. It's really,
That's super cool.
a
Yeah,
really
that
good
sounds right
writer.
up my alley. That sounds right up my alley. Anything like that.
Yeah, honestly, her other series, it's like longer. The books are more like actual novels as opposed to like these are the other ones are like a much shorter, but beautifully written. Strong recommendation for me. And she's like local-ish, I think.
Cool. Yeah, I'll definitely check her out. That sounds awesome. That sounds right up my alley. It reminded me, before Ball Lightning, I read this book that was pretty new by Ray Naylor called The Mountain in the Sea, The Mountain Under the Sea. And it's kind of similarly, it's a futuristic world where corporations get so big they can just like buy out countries and portions of continents. And this AI company buys out what we would call Vietnam because they learn that there's a school, or I don't know what you'd call it, a colony of octopodes that seem to exhibit culture. And so they're having this like sectioning it off as a study area to then try to see how they can use their knowledge to try to influence their development of AI, which is really interesting. So it gets into some interesting aspects of like, what is culture? What is language? How do we recognize that in other species? And how do we define that? So there's some fun themes there. The author sort of based portions of it on really interesting, what I remember, ethnographic work done in the Amazon. And so it's an interesting sort of look into that as well, so I love that kind of stuff.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I feel like we should start a book club. But
yeah, that'd be great.
On that note, thank you so very much. And I look forward to talking to you about biocultural archaeology is what I'm going to call it.
Sure, I like it. Let's go with that.
All right, see you soon.
Pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks for joining me for this episode of the Anthrobiology Podcast. If you have questions or comments, you can reach me at gabby.lapera@anthrobiology.com. That's spelled GABY.LAPERA@anthrobiology.com. This show is produced by me. Music courtesy of Chad Crouch, aka Poddington Bear at Sound of Picture.